So I think it's safe to say that there's no one on this call who is not familiar with what's going on in Ukraine right now between Russia and Ukraine. Been a big news topic for about 6 weeks now, well, for over 6 weeks since before it even started officially. We've all read the news stories about the military progress, the counterattacks, how the Russians expected a quick victory in a few days, did not get it, how they got stalled, and in many cases have been turned back, suffering far more losses than they ever expected. The West, in some cases united, in some cases individually and separately as countries and even as individual companies, have imposed significant sanctions on the Russians, I think far more painful than Mr. Putin probably anticipated in advance. And there's an impressive array of ripple effects that are spreading out from that. And those ripple effects have not been written about as much in the news as the military stuff, which is easier for people to understand. The ripple effects are having far more longer-term effects in the world, and not only immediately, but in the future as well. And that's what we're going to learn about today. Our speaker, David Edick, is an expert on a number of things. David is the founder and principal of Core Global Advisory, which specializes in commodities, logistics, market strategy, issues of international political and diplomacy. I consider David one of the most knowledgeable people I know in a number of different areas related to international affairs and economy. David has lived and worked in both Mexico and Russia, in addition to the US, and speaks fluent Russian. He's a member of the Energy Committee of the Western Regional Partnership, which is a partnership of the Department of Defense and 6 Southwestern states and tribal councils. David is a 3-term past president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. And in fact, he had gotten me involved on the board several years ago on the World Affairs Council, very dynamic organization. He's a 6-term past president of the San Diego's International Sister Cities program, and was the driving force some years ago between San Diego and Vladivostok linking up as sister cities. David has his bachelor's degree from San Diego State University. It was actually a custom designed degree in political economy that David put together. And I think that gives you a little bit of a flavor for what David's background is. David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, Dan. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome everybody to an immensely complicated and fast-moving topic. I'm delighted to be here to be speaking to the Financial Executives Networking Group. I've done several presentations to the group before, locally and nationally here, with some international voices that are on this call. So let me share my screen. Get going here. I've got a slideshow to work from. Come on, girl. Okay. All right. So I'm here today to talk about sanctions and supply chains and the implications of the war in Ukraine. This is a gigantic topic, but I'm going to give a stab at it. And with some questions, you can help guide the discussion. I can talk about this all day long, both the geopolitical and the economic sides of things. So back on February 24th, a long-awaited Russian military action against Ukraine turned into a full-scale invasion. February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. It is not just about Ukraine, and as Dan mentioned, the campaign has gone very differently than what the Russians expected, what Putin expected. Something very closely run operation from the inside, and they let groupthink and their own hall of mirrors and delusions get in the way, and this will complicate things for everyone, including the Russians, going forward. But nonetheless, a war started, and it's the biggest, nastiest thing going on in Europe since the Second World War. We're living at a hinge in history. What was is really no more. We're just seeing, hearing the echoes. The world is going to be a whole lot different going forward. It is what it is. The war is no longer just in Ukraine, and this is something you want to consider going forward. This is burning oil storage, fuel storage tanks in Belgorod, Russia. Attacked last Friday, I believe, by a couple Ukrainian helicopters, air-to-ground missiles, and satellite, an important fuel storage designed in part as part of the supply chain for Russian forces in Ukraine. So before I jump into the sanctions, so there's this war between, Russia is making war on Ukraine. And the initial plan in Russia was that it would take maybe a week. Well, it's taken a whole lot more than that. And one of the consequences of that is in fact the West has declared its own war on Russia, an economic war. And it's through the channel and application of sanctions that war against Russia is being waged at this time. So I understand this is a busy slide here, and you have access to the slide deck afterwards, and you look through it. So what are sanctions? They're coercive measures that can be applied for a variety of purposes on other states. They're commonly non-military in nature, one state against another, or against international organizations, or by international organizations, excuse me. Some of the sanctions I do want to point out here are targeted against specific people. They've become the go-to response for the United States in recent decades to punish or compel policy action by actors, entities, or countries abroad. In part, it's a signal, it can be a political signal to show that we're doing something, but it's also a very powerful tool, sometimes unappreciated by policymakers, by business, and by adversaries. And quite frankly, the Russians, while they anticipated some kind of sanctions, they didn't anticipate what came. So again, this is something to refer to in the future. In the United States, who applies sanctions? Well, sanctions can be applied by the President of the United States by executive order or by US Congress. US Congress presents a very complicating pathway to resolve sanctions passed by Congress. Requires another act of Congress, and that puts you into domestic politics here in the United States. And for Americans, it's hard enough for us to understand, and for people from abroad, it's a nightmare. And ultimately, they will need to hire consulting agencies and everything. In this instance, sanctions against Russia are all being levied out of the office of the President of the United States. So that means that the president this president or a future president can authorize the removal of those sanctions. So for the time being, it's, while powerful sanctions are being levied, they're still mobile, if you will. They can be removed should things change in Russia, which I do not anticipate anytime soon. One sanction name, or whatever, a concept, if you will, the Magnitsky Act. This is something that you always want to have in the back of your mind. This has become kind of an all-purpose tool for the U.S. government to express dislike over policies inside other countries. The Magnitsky Act applies globally. So this extraterritoriality, this extraterritorial application of US law is complained about bitterly in the emerging world, underdeveloped world, if you will. Other countries get to experience the consequences of something that they didn't have any part in, and are not able to affect going forward. It's about human rights, and I expect that the Magnitsky Act will be applied fruitfully in the months and years to come regards Russia. A couple of years ago, the European Union passed their own Magnitsky Act. This is one of the most powerful of all the sanctions that the U.S. has applied because of its sprawling nature and kind of the almost spontaneous application. It's willful application for political purposes, not so much for strategic purposes, but for political purposes. In the United States, the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Treasury Department, they're the ones that are responsible for administering sanctions policies. If you want to understand who's being sanctioned and under what terms, it's at the Office of Foreign Assets Control. You can go to the website and dig around if you wish. I would tell you that if you are rowing around in the world of sanctions and you have significant financial or material risk involved, get yourself a lawyer, a trade lawyer with real experience. This is it's a challenging area, and to self-manage your way through this process is tricky. That all said, a visit to this website is definitely informative. Are sanctions effective? Sometimes, well, maybe. It's commonly stated in the activist world that sanctions on South Africa were effective in breaking the back of the apartheid regime in the late 1980s. And that's may or may not be true. I think there's some good reason to believe that it is. However, one has to really look at each individual case on its own. And South Africa had a number of unique circumstances that don't necessarily apply to everyone else. The reality is the effectiveness is hard to measure. While this fellow Derson Pexin did a study and said that the sanctions produced a meaningful behavior change about 40% of the time. The U.S. GAO did their own study, and they were unable to establish any clear causality. So, are these sanctions effective? Maybe. Are they consequential? Definitely.
And David, if I could add a comment, I think that the effectiveness of sanctions, at least to a good extent, partially depends on who the person is in power in the country being targeted, because some leaders will not want their own people to get hurt significantly, and some leaders really don't care about that one way or the other. Isn't that right?
Well, there's a lot of moving parts to it. I mean, the United States applies sanctions, other countries also apply sanctions, and there's history to this. There's a lot to be said about the role of sanctions in driving, ultimately cornering Japan in the lead up to the war in the Pacific in World War II. But there are many countries in this world. There are lots of people. There are lots of organizations. And one of the things about the Magnitsky Act is that it has this all-encompassing aspect to it, which seems to solve a lot of those problems in terms of effectiveness. But in reality, I mean, that's kind of like maybe a lawyer's view, if I could be cruel to lawyers today. But in its practical impact, it's almost terrorizing. If the intended party is hit and affected, okay, well, a goal is achieved, but the collateral damage from sanctions can be quite serious, and it's almost as if using sanctions is, you know, most effective in the early days, the early times that you apply it. You know, the most effective maybe the first or the second or third time, but going forward, it becomes less effective as people anticipate what might be coming. But also the other parts of the world, you know, become increasingly jaded about the whole thing. So coming back to the current situation, one of the most remarkable developments of this particular war and the reaction to it by non-combatants, by the West, are self-sanctions by companies, self-sanctioning their own behavior in the market in terms of their interaction with Russian companies or Russian products or Russian securities. A big part of, you know, why will companies self-sanction? Well, there's a practical side of it. They're afraid of future sanctions. And looking at the war in Ukraine and the scale of what's going on, companies have a right to be concerned about the you know, massive and developing nature of what's going on. I mean, you know, just in the since Friday, there are two events that just in my life are, you know, have monumentally changed how I see things. And I mean, it's like going back to the end of the Cold War, where you pick, you know, from one day to the next, the news brings really dramatic change. So for companies that fear sanctions, future sanctions, they're worried that they might get stuck with products that they can't sell if new sanctions are ramped up, or that penalties may cause potential clients or partners to balk at future dealing. Another aspect is the reputational damage for companies that say continue to do business with Russian products or Russian companies, or do business in Russia. The damage to their customers, may think poorly of it and may take their business elsewhere. So, for example, a company like McDonald's, for example, where, you know, it's very much a you know, aspirational side of, you know, how one spends money, very, you know, discretionary spending oriented. You know, these kinds of companies, consumer goods in particular, are going to be very sensitive to what their other customers are doing. Then there's the recent tidal wave, essentially, of ESG in the world. There are a number of financial people on the call here. It's environmental, social, and governance reasons are causing boards to consider very carefully the consequences of continuing their business relationship with Russia. Also, there's you know, the general solidarity with Ukraine. It's very popular right now. but it is what it is. What has not gotten talked about yet is the potential that the self-sanctioning behavior may present policymakers with complicating challenges. I can see this being a factor in Europe, and particularly in particular with the trade of liquid hydrocarbons, refined fuels, or crude oil, but particularly refined fuels, I think, where Russian exports into Europe are a very, very significant part of the European market. And the supply chains, the ecosystem by which these products move from Russia into markets and to consumers in Europe is rather complex. It's not one company provides all the services, and it only takes one company in a chain to step out or become an issue that can really disrupt things. So it's going to turn out that I think that the companies are going to require some sort of clarifying action from their governments or regulators about what to do and what not to do. And in part, that'll help cover themselves for complaints from shareholders or from activists or governments abroad.
David,
yeah.
Just to clarify, since what I heard you say is since oil and gas, or as you call it, hydrocarbons, are such a material part of Russia's GDP, why do you think that maybe NATO or some of the leaders in this situation haven't reached out to Germany, specifically in Europe, or China and India, who are picking up the misplacements of those hydrocarbons and encourage them to put more teeth into the sanctions on Russia by not purchasing those hydrocarbons and seeking alternatives, so it really hurt Russia a bit more economically?
So far, only the United States and to some degree forthcoming the UK are actually sanctioning energy products. Germany has turned the page to a new chapter, and really all of Europe has, but Germany is an important case going forward. I do not believe that the Kremlin anticipated that the German response would be to put 100 billion euros into German defense spending this year on top of the existing budget, and assure 2% of GDP spending going forward. And this is being repeated in countries around Northern Europe. This is a strategic shift by the Germans, by Europe. It's just that the economic history of two generations, and going deep back into the Soviet period, where energy demand after coal moving to oil and gas, the demand was in Europe. Their local reserves in the beginning were significant, then with economic growth weren't sufficient, and then those reserves began to decline, and it was Russian supplies that filled the gap going forward. And Russia's, and I'll get to some slides about that in the future. So the changing direction in Europe is not going to be easy. Those that say that Europe had done nothing are mistaken. It's long been understood that there were risks in the trade, the hydrocarbons trade, and there's an entity in Europe that produced annual reports on where the risk points were and how to deal with them. And Europe has significantly increased its imports of liquefied natural gas in an effort to diversify. The Germans get tarred with, well, you didn't have any LNG degasification plants in Germany, but Northern Europe is an integrated gas infrastructure, and LNG can come into the Netherlands or Belgium and you can contract for it out of Germany. So, sometimes it's quite unhelpful to look at things in terms of nation states. You want to look at terms more like infrastructure or ecosystems or groupings. The future of the EU, things are really different in Europe now, strategically and economically. India is a different case, far, far away, never been a major consumer of Russian oil. It's too far away. The transportation costs are prohibitive. The Indians have stepped in to pick up some deeply discounted cargoes. And it makes sense because, India is one of those countries that is, the big jump in prices here has been more about sentiment and panic rather than a dislocation of supply. Those dislocations are coming later. But much of the world is at the sidelines on this stuff. They didn't have anything to do with what's going on, and they are going to bear the consequences, and they do not have the deep financial wallet to pay their way through a crisis that, Europe has that wallet. The United States has that wallet, Japan. But most other countries in the world, do not have that capacity. China is a different story. Well, I'm gonna run forward, and there will be stuff in this presentation that will further address your question.
David,
Yeah.
I think Charlize has a question. Charlize, you want to ask?
Yes, I was wondering what you see as the viable alternative energy sources or hydrocarbon sources to Russian. When you address that people are concerned that Europe is not doing enough to sanction Russian supplies, they need energy. And what are the viable sources that are not very exposed to military intervention that they could reach out to?
Well, that's an interesting question here, and let me just do this, since this is how things are working today.
If you want me to put it on hold, I can.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're going to get to it, David, just
Yeah, I am.
Okay, put it on hold.
Okay. All right. So financial sanctions. This is one of the big developments that was, I believe, very much unanticipated in the Kremlin. They expected to be cut off from dollars. And what ended up happening was Europe declared sanctioned Russian central bank reserves held in various countries across Europe. So this war in Ukraine has been coming for a long time, and Putin and the Kremlin have been preparing for a conflict for a long time, and they've been preparing for financial sanctions from the United States for a long time. And the Russian reserves have been growing in part to sterilize the vast trade surpluses driven by energy. I mean, if all that money comes pouring back into Russia, it'd drive inflation, and it would really strengthen the ruble and plays havoc with Russian manufacturing. And you end up with a lot of asset inflation in Russia. It's true. So one of the ways to deal with that was to keep the money offshore in a sovereign wealth fund, and the central bank built up reserves abroad, kind of sterilizing it outside the ruble space. And it's a lot of money. And here showing the blue, these are financial reserves, and the yellow showing gold. The Russians have really gone out of their way to build a vast store of gold in Moscow, so they don't have to worry like Venezuela did about having their gold in London and having it sanctioned, and ending up with potentially somebody else. I did want to spend a little time on the reserves part of things. So coming into the war, actually, this is the middle of the year last year. Since 2017, Russia has gone out of its way to de-dollarize its reserves with and to reduce their exposure to US sanctions. And what they did was they expanded their holdings of euros, they expanded their holdings of gold, they reduced their dollar holdings, they very much increased their holdings of Chinese yuan. They do a lot of trade with China. And by geography here, those reserves are held, the gold in Moscow, China, France, Japan, Germany, US. And for the financial people on the call here,
Most of us.
many, okay, yeah, so a lot of central bankers, are looking to generate earnings, a cross between earnings and safety and liquidity. And you can see here that the different ways in which financial securities and gold are held. So it's a nice diversification with weighting around the A grades. So you can see here this looking at the purple part. This is the effect of the soaring and both production, the recovery of the oil sector in Russia, and the noughties, if you will, 2000 to 2010, to the Great Recession, basically. And with soaring oil prices, a big burst of reserves. The measuring on the left is the percentage of GDP. So as of a month ago, Russia's central bank reserves were nearly 45% of national GDP. So the Russians felt that they had stashed away a goodly pile of resources that they could use to it provided them financial and economic flexibility, if you will. Well, and then it turned out that in particular, it was the action of the European Central Bank and national bank regulators in Europe to freeze those euro-denominated securities, those euro-denominated reserves. Biggest hammer in the tool shed, absolutely. The U.S. also sanctioned the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund and their National Development Fund. There are implications of what has taken place in terms of sanctioning reserves. There will be other countries around the world that may or may not have disputes with the United States or Europe, and they will rethink their profile about how they position their reserves. They may do that. It's not an easy thing to shift around. No, the Chinese yuan renminbi is not going to become the global reserve currency anytime soon. That's a complicating factor for anybody that wants to do reserves in a different way. And now with Europe having acted the way it did, countries, central banks will find themselves perhaps more beholden to the United States policy than they desire. Two imperatives behind reserve stock building. One is to do intervention or stabilization of their domestic markets, or to build a war chest against shocks, disasters, a balance of payments, crises abroad. Their trade, their current account interaction with the rest of the world. We'll see how this event, this huge event, what the implications actually are in practice. This will take some time to develop. There is some question as to whether this may discourage companies from borrowing in foreign currency, but we'll see. But this is an area to keep your eye on going forward. Sanctions on oligarchs. Everybody's bad boy. They are pretty much all men. The assumption is that they all have misgotten gains. And yes, I was there in the 90s in the world's greatest gold rush, the spontaneous privatization of state assets for private purposes. But also the reality is, as many built serious companies on their own wiles in a very tough environment. Not everybody is a crook. And one of the fellows that I would say that is not so much a crook and is actually a pretty serious business guy is Alexei Mordashov. He is his claim to fame. His company is Severstal. It's Russia's largest steel company, and he was hit by sanctions. His company, and as a result, the company was effectively sanctioned. Europe being about a big part of their market. So this was remember. So the sanctions went on Mordashov, but Severstal is getting hit. So firstly, Severstal steel shipments to Europe. Okay, last year Severstal sold about 3 million tons of steel to Europe. About a quarter of their production. Let's see if I can get this up. This was a financially strong company by any measure. Their production assets had been refurbished, upgraded, in pretty much most cases state of the art. Their financial position very strong, very low debt, strong cash. On February 28th, the EU imposed sanctions against a number of people, individuals, one of them being Mordashov. Mordashov holds 77% of Severstal. He's chairman of the board, and that's 77% stake in Severstal. At the end of last year, his net worth was somewhere on the order of $25 billion. It isn't anymore. So in terms of how sanctions that are directed at an individual, that the companies that they are involved with, and what does that mean? How involved with? Is it ownership? Is it governance? Influence, or what? There were some that suggested, well, if Mordashov stepped down from the company board, he could avoid, Severstal could avoid all these problems. But the third item here is particular, that, these sanctions can be quite broadly interpreted, and in particular the ones that the European Union passed. And so that the company is left with a very uncertain situation that requires them to send their lawyers to Brussels and elsewhere. But in the meantime, it has really disrupted the shipments of Severstal steel into Europe. And this is part of the manufacturing supply chain in Europe. Russian steels, many of them are actually quite high quality and are not easily replaced elsewhere. It would be replaced at a considerable price, and in terms of quality may take a significant amount of time to find appropriate replacement supplies. Then another really interesting development, Severstal is borrowings abroad, and they tried to service their debts and make interest payments. And those interest payments got caught up in the sanctions as well. And for a company that is so strong financially to be taken to the brink of default, I mean, it gives you an idea of just how powerful these financial sanctions can be, how consequential they can be. And you can go from a very healthy, robust environment to on a weird kind of life support. You almost have a virtual reality or parallel realities going on. And and the Severstal made their payment, but their paying agent, Citibank, held that up because of their concerns over having sanctions being somehow affected and then being held liable. And banks around the world have become very sensitive, very sensitized to American sanctions, because many big banks around the world have been presented with billion-dollar penalties by the US Treasury, and you pay those penalties or you go find another way to do business. I mean, these were basically existential threats to the health of these global scale banks. So banks don't mess around with this stuff. Like very, 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 very conservative. But ultimately, Citibank has recommended the Severstal approach. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, I pointed to that earlier in the presentation, and OFAC does provide license channels, to do things that may be restricted by the sanctions, but you can apply for waivers. It doesn't mean you'll get it, but sometimes there are outs. I have not heard anything about the Severstal case in the last 10 days or so. So it seems that some kind of deal has been found, because otherwise you'd have a big storm going on as creditors, that are owed some minor amount of money or chasing, a billion-dollar company to control whatever assets they may have, financial assets they may have abroad, or attempt to get some sort of redress inside Russia. But it's interesting that Severstal was not subject to any sanctions, okay, and that Mordashov himself was not subject to the sanctions in the United States. It was EU sanctions. That just gives you an idea of how impactful these things are. I was on a call yesterday consulting with a US-based automotive parts manufacturer that 7 factories in Europe and a plant in Canada and Mexico, and talking about the supply chain shock and how to things to consider in the prospects of natural gas cutoff in Europe, or exceedingly high prices going forward. Just a very, very I mean, to call it a dynamic environment is is not fair. It's practically revolutionary. I mean, this is war, okay? And we all in North America and Western Europe, we don't have a lot of experience with this. So it turns out that these latest set of sanctions, for the financial people on the call here, and I know there's a goodly number of them, that payments, the infrastructure by which companies service their debts or distribute dividends, that the infrastructure by which these things are transacted, all this infrastructure is impacted by the existing sanctions that are out there, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And it's war. We just have to pay attention to what's going on And I guess this is where you really earn the bucks to either generate returns on assets or make sure you don't lose what you've got. This year, Russian companies are going to need make about $18.5 billion of international bond payments. So, I mean, this is a significant amount of money. And the idea that investors could have, take legal action to reclaim unpaid amounts. I mean, lawyers will be maybe, and I'm maybe being cruel to lawyers on this. There will be those that are focused on the transactional nature of what all is going on, and offer courses of action. But I think it's really important to look at the whole picture. Sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something. And one thing that a number of companies have done is actually just write everything off. And if it becomes viable in the future, they can add that windfall, if you will, to their future accounts. So running into energy here, again, the United States is March 8th declared a ban. It'll come into effect after. So I mean, there was a fair amount of cargo that was at sea when the ban came on, and that those cargoes at sea are not affected. It's future business. So this is an aspect of where the price shock here in the United States was driven more by sentiment and psychology rather than actual physical constraints on supply. But those constraints are coming, and there's a lot of scrambling going on. So the United States banned the import of Russian oil, LNG, coal is not a factor, but LNG is, especially in the Northeast. It's a long story. Because of the Jones Act and the cost of moving cargo inside the United States, it turns out that the east coast of the United States, especially the Northeast, and with the decline of the refining infrastructure in the Northeast, the East Coast and Northeast have become dependent to a considerable degree on imports of refined products from Canada and from Europe. This new investment in Russia's energy sector. This is a factor. I'm just noting here, that Hawaii is kind of a forgotten case here. That Hawaii has it's dependent of a third to half of their. They have a refinery there, and they're dependent on about a third to half of their oil supply coming from the Russian Far East. They'll be able to figure it out and replace it, but at considerable extra cost. And oil is not necessarily directly interchangeable. They will need to find oil that has similar physical characteristics of what they are no longer able to buy in Russia. But the new investments in Russia's energy sector, and that includes in the Russian Far East, Sakhalin Island, the U.S. largest foreign investment in Russia is by Exxon in the Sakhalin 1 project, and Exxon is now trying to figure out how to leave. They are not able to expand, and there were plans to do so. This is a significant issue. What is less clear is U.S. Oil and gas service companies, Baker, Schlumberger, others that provide some of the more advanced drilling and production technologies to Russians. I mean, Russians can do most of this themselves, and no one should think that having U.S. companies leave is going to leave them high and dry. They'll do less, but it could be very much a factor in future as Russia's legacy fields run down, and their moves into the Arctic offshore and into more challenging geology does require Western technology and experience. There is an awareness that what the US does is not necessarily applicable in Europe because of the market realities in terms of interdependence with Russian supply. So looking at the US, it's around 7.5% of the US supply. It's going to be resolvable. The replacement cargoes, it looks like they're going to come out of the Middle East. That's where the action is right now. There had been some talk about reviving trade with Venezuela that has domestic political implications. It gets into the food fight between Democrats and Republicans inside Congress and in the US public politics space. So we'll see where things go with Venezuela in the future. Gasoline from Russia is a major factor on the East Coast, about a fifth of US gasoline imports, and that's a big factor on the East Coast. The US exports a lot of refined products to Latin America. It's just it's a curious world. The supplies will be replacement supplies will be found. It's diesel that presents the biggest challenge in the fuels world. Diesel is running very thin inventories, continuing to decline in recent years, and they are very thin, and they are dangerously thin in Northern Europe. There is some leading trading people have spoken up and said that in coming months there could actually be physical shortfalls, just not able, we don't have something to sell you kind of situation, and that will not just it'll affect prices, which will be crazy, but it will, you know, that allocation that goes on. If you're a trucking company in Northern Europe, you may not be able to get fuel. UK, the same kind of a thing. And what's already begun is, since diesel is cheaper in the United States than it is in Europe right now, and we've got it and they don't, cargoes of diesel have started to leave the Northeast US for Europe. And this will continue. So diesel prices, which are already very high here in the United States, in our experience, are headed a lot higher. I hesitate to put a number to try to predict where it's going to be, but this is real trouble coming for the logistics business, ground logistics in North America and Europe, and then there are all the cars and buses and all that depend on diesel. So talking about Russian exports to destinations, I'm going to sit here on this graphic for a minute to let you all absorb it, and I'll go through it. Starting with this 29% here, this is where Russian oil exports go. And last year, 29% of oil exports went to the European Union. 16% of Russian liquid hydrocarbon exports went to European Union as refined product, as diesel, as gasoline, as gas oil or fuel oil. Those for Europe, the product imports from Europe are very substantial in terms of Russia. China, Russia exports about 22% of their exports to China. A lot of that is done through Asia, though, through the East Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline that comes out at the Kosmino terminal just east of Vladivostok, and oil from Sakhalin Island. It's a long way from the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, around through the Red Sea, around India, through the Straits of Malacca, up to China. It's a long way. And the transportation costs are serious, and it ties up ships as well. You can see here that the United States is around roughly 10%. Okay, oil on the left, gas on the right. Let's look at, this is too complicated. I'm going to move on. You can come back to it. Maritime logistics. I really want to spend a little time on this because this is where any effort to reposition. So if Europe embargoes today, or say over the next few years decides to de-Russify their oil and refined products imports from Russia, they're going to not do that anymore from Russia. They're going to get them someplace else. The Middle East, maybe a little bit from North America, but mostly from the Middle East. Those Russian supplies, they will try to place them elsewhere. And if it's going to go to China or to India, that's a long way to sail. I want to talk about LNG a little bit here to give you an idea of how the logistics work. So US has about a quarter of the world LNG market and exports much of it to Asia and also a lot of it to Europe. And depending on who is and it's done on about two-thirds of it now is spot market trading, not just these long-term contracts, but spot market trading is now a big part of US LNG sales abroad. Big cold snap in Asia at between 20 and 20 in the winter of 2021 caused prices to take off in Asia. Prices for LNG soared, and demand for those spot cargoes soared, and it actually sucked cargo out of Europe, which didn't need it, and it required LNG tankers to haul it. And instead of hauling LNG across the Atlantic, charters were now having to haul it all the way to Asia, either across the Atlantic through the Suez all the way across the Indian Ocean and up, or through the Panama Canal and all the way to the Pacific Ocean, basically tying up a tanker for twice as long. When Europe ran into its gas crisis this last fall and winter, long story here, and ultimately gas prices, LNG and gas prices finally got above the prices in Asia and diverted cargo out of Asia. Asian storages were full. So suddenly the Asians started selling their cargoes to Europe, and nobody was shipping anything across the Pacific or those long distance voyages to Asia. And while there was a tidal wave of US LNG, a flotilla going to Europe, tanker rates went negative. So, I mean, that gives you an idea of some of the crazy stuff that can go on. The same kind of thing will come with oil, where this shuffling of shells, if you will, is going to require tankers to move it. And those tankers will need to be crewed, and much of the crew's population in the world of shipping is either Russian or Ukrainian. And there's a war on, and there's sanctions on, but you're going to need a whole lot more tankers to move cargo, and those tankers are going to be expensive, and there are sanctions involved. that will affect the ability of parties and counterparties to move to pay for services. So it'll be interesting to see how, and you throw in the self-sanctioning behavior, we'll see how things go. I'm just, so you running across the Pacific, excuse me, the Atlantic. Many of these, this is a couple days ago, and you can get this stuff online. You know, this is not some sort of industry secret. You can see the cargoes that are obviously headed for Europe, but you can also sense this trail that runs across and will ultimately head through the Suez toward Asia. Latin America has also been a big buyer of US LNG. Brazil's drought last year was a key factor in triggering the price crisis in Europe. It won't be a factor this year, but they're on the sidelines of what may transpire going forward in terms of Europe trying to de-Russify their gas supplies and maybe buy more from the United States. There are other countries that have traditionally depended on US supplies of liquefied natural gas. They're going to find themselves having to pay much, much higher price for cargoes if they can get them at all. There's a lot of stuff on this map, but I really want to draw two. This Danish Straits. So most Russian oil and refined products comes primarily from two areas. One out of the Baltic, the Primorsk crude oil facility, or Ust-Luga. There are a number of facilities there along the Gulf of Finland, St. Petersburg over here. You get this traffic, most of it going to Northwestern Europe. If you're going to have to find buyers in India or in China, that you're going to soak up a lot of additional tanker capacity to deal with those volumes. Same thing out of Novorossiysk on Russia's oil port on the Black Sea. Same kind of a thing, mostly going into Southern Europe. If that market is lost, those cargoes are going to have to go elsewhere. They aren't going to go to North America. But not much of a market, import market availability for in Latin America. Accepting refined products, let me say that. There's not a lot of crude oil demand, import demand here, but the United States sells around 3.5 million barrels a day of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel, et cetera, to Latin America. It's a big thing for the U.S. industry. I suppose that there's an opportunity for the Russians, but again, these long sailings, they'll have to offer discounts, and it'll tie up tankers. And tankers are going to get expensive. So I think the long story is actually that Russia's ability to sell abroad is going to be constrained in a significant way, and this is where, not just this year, but in the years to come, as the world tries to reposition its points of supply and all, there's going to be a lot of turbulence. There's going to be a lot of extra expense. And there'll be opportunities for things to screw up along the way. This is just going to be and you end up with net less Russian oil on the market. The oil market is already essentially no spare capacity. The impact on prices can be quite striking. So I don't think this is part of the reason why the U.S. is putting the strategic oil reserve on the market right now. Most of it's politics, but I will tell you that the world is very poorly positioned this is a very inconvenient time to try to do without 2 to 4 million barrels a day of Russian crude and refined product.
Hey, David?
Yeah.
So it almost seems like that the picture is painting a conclusion, and maybe I'm jumping too far here, but it's like, okay, the United States made a decision. We're not committing troops to the Ukraine. We're applying economic sanctions, but economic sanctions do not come for free to us or to our allies. So essentially what's going on is that what had been in peacetime a fairly well greased set of machinery for transporting energy around the world is suddenly disrupted, and it's going to cost the Russians a lot, but it's also going to cost the West a lot in terms of increased times for delivery and increased cost, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So we're trading off lives of troops and people for money, if you look at it in that way.
Yeah, so first I thought you were going to say that we had a well-oiled machine, and sort of is no more.
Well, that's right.
So the West, Europe and the North America, by and large, we're going to be able to pay for this. It will be very painful. It will have
Right.
cost implications all through our economies, and for low-income people in
That's right.
Europe and North America, it's a problem. It's a really significant one. No, and it's not an academic discussion here at all.
Yeah.
For low-income countries around the world, this is really serious stuff.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why the Indians are saying, well, you all can, you all have your reasons and
Right.
we have ours, and we have to take care of the well-being of our country. We don't have a dog in this fight. And really in much of the world, how this all came to pass is seen somewhat differently. The war itself is a really ugly thing, and it will lead to some reconsideration elsewhere in the world. I don't actually, while the West has been the one has declared this economic war with sanctions, what has, and I don't think much of the quality of thinking out of the Kremlin, to be honest with you. I mean, there was so much illusion and delusion in the planning and what they expected to find on invading Ukraine, and the responses from the West. There was quite a bit of groupthink, and you tell the boss what he wants to hear, and that's not a good thing. So having a sense of how ultimately, there are smart people in Moscow, make no mistake, and at some point there will be those that consider the option of, well, we can take our own economic war actions too. And maybe a bit of a hint of this was the demand from Moscow that Europe pay for its natural gas in rubles rather than euros. And the view in Moscow is that, why should we sell gas that you're going to pay for in euros, and then you're going to sanction that money and we're not going to see it? So what are we doing here? So if you want gas, you'll pay us rubles. So that's just going to get worked through. A number of East European countries have already said that they will pay in rubles. The big countries in Western Europe have said, no, we will not. but there's discussions between Germans and Moscow on how this might be worked out. Just got to say that you know, the rest of the world is still vulnerable for the Russians to do something rash on the economic side. You know, disrupting the, you know, putting an embargo on exports of diesel, for example. Tomorrow would throw Northwestern Europe into a panic, and for very good reasons. And they would get down right away. And these exercises are already being done about how either natural gas or, say, diesel would be allocated. I mean, they would do government allocation. This would leave the market behind, and you would have government allocation of supplies. So, you know, I get what you're saying about, you know, you're able to take kind of the cheap route of using sanctions rather than to get involved militarily in Ukraine. We'll see where that all ends up. I mean, this is monumental stuff going on here. I mean, this is hinge of history time. And I'm not even going to try to tell you what's going to happen next week. Not even.
Hey, David.
It's not risk, it's uncertainty, unmeasurable. Yes, question.
Hi, this is Jim Soloway. It's a fascinating picture, a very scary one you're painting here. And it strikes me that there has to be a whole lot of demand destruction ahead in order to square this circle. You know, when you adjust for inflation, oil prices at 110 or wherever they are today is still well below where they got in, say, 2008, where inflation adjusted terms, it was more like $185. And back in 1979, on inflation adjusted terms in today's dollars, it was around 160. So, and we're not even talking about other critical materials that also have been caught up in sanctions, whether it's metals or food. And so this is really harking back to the sort of disruptions to the global economy that we saw in the 1970s.
Oh, for sure. That is a good reference point, both in terms of the scale of the shock and the consequences. So demand destruction is going to be could be a very big part of the response in various commodities. And on the political side, they're scared to death. This has got the Germans completely focused on what's going on. They are fully aware of the risks involved, that you can make political or ethical decisions that will have major economic consequences and political consequences as well. But you know, what is demand destruction? You know, is kind of a cute economic name for lose your job, lose your company, and no one should take that. No one should take that lightly. I mean, it's part of the whole spectrum of this conflict. The demand destruction in natural gas last year was enormous in Europe, fertilizer sector, metals, any of the, in oil refining, it really hurt. It hampered European oil refining because they needed hydrogen to for in elements of the refining process to upgrade some of the heavier stuff, and that hydrogen came from natural gas. So with the cutoff, with the decision to shut down European fertilizer plants, they started sourcing, those European multinational fertilizer companies started sourcing their supplies from North America or elsewhere in the world, and the price of fertilizer has doubled basically this last year. And one of the consequences of that is that farmers they're going to weigh, in the developed world in particular, they will weigh how much fertilizer they apply to their fields which will affect the yields. You know, so I mean, in addition to having physical cutoffs of grain flows in the Black Sea, the reduction in yields worldwide, agricultural yields, this is really maybe the more troubling part of what will actually happen worldwide. There's a question out there.
Yeah, I have a question. I
Hey, Dan.
did.
Yeah, hi. Good to see you.
It's just not to be too much of a Cassandra, but we had these two Arctic temperature shocks, and which might be pointing to something that we don't expect in climate, especially in developing countries. And with constraints, if not suspensions, of fertilizer from Ukraine, or fertilizer components for nitrogen fixation from Russia and Ukraine, we could be looking at a situation, another combined situation, such as led in 2010 to the Arab Spring. So we've got all kinds of interesting and horrible possibilities for horrible security problems, which could then, of course, disrupt even more the economic situation.
Well, for sure, and we're just coming off this pandemic where the world really demonstrated its incapacity to work with each other. I have to say that wasn't very encouraging, and so we're getting well practiced at, kind of trying to be independent or, flying alone. And this would be a time where collaboration is really kind of crucial, So I'm definitely concerned. You mentioned the climate, and while it's not part of the supply chain discussion per se, my view is that this is all going to result in basically a lost decade in global decarbonization. There are those that are promoting the expansions of renewables in Europe and elsewhere as a response. I think that that's going to be a lot more troublesome than it looks, and it's going to take time. Europe had already run into problems with installations of windmills on land and infrastructure to move electricity. The offshore wind is the potential is there, it's considerable. But it's not the answer. And what's going on is there's a problem of now or even yesterday. And so the horizon of planning is practically politically sustainable planning is getting pretty narrow. So I think it's going to be a while before the discussions on decarbonization are going to get real traction. I mean, we're just not going to have the political bandwidth, the public political bandwidth, and then the elite political bandwidth to deal with it, and the cost pressures on the cost of living are going to be focusing people pretty intensely for a while. Let me see what I got left here. A couple slides. So, one of the
we have somebody with their hands raised.
Yeah, we got
okay.
two people.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't see this well, so can somebody pick them for me?
Yeah, Charlize, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I have another question. As you have de-Russification, or whatever you want to call it, you also have a disassembly of pre-existing logistics methods and the impact on hydrocarbons, but also steel, which impacts the auto industry, which is an underpinning of most economies. So it all looks horrible. And my question is, where is the pocket? Who will be the winners as a result of this? And secondarily, do you think, given all this major global impact, are the sanctions really sustainable?
Yeah, a bunch of good questions there, big ones, and you really finished it with.
Sorry.
I do think the sanctions are are sustainable because this is war, and what's becoming increasingly apparent, certainly to me, is that this is no longer about Russia and Ukraine. It's gone not just viral, it's gone global, and we'll see where this all goes. You know, I had always I had thought that Putin's and Moscow's position was one about you know, geosecurity, security arrangements in Europe, and then now it's about going back to the 19th century. It's like, no, it's not going to happen. But he's trying, and a lot of people are dying for it, and just the delusion, converting that delusion into rational understanding somewhere in the future, either with a new leader or somebody waking up. This is going to go on for a while, and it's really, there's no walking away from it. It's a tragedy of the first order. The economic damage, and it's economics that were the basis of this gas bridge between Soviet Union and now Russia and Europe. It was all about economics. And even during the depths of the Cold War, we got economics, and then we got politics. We're not going to let the two mix. We're going to have peaceful coexistence, and we'll just have certain areas that we will agree to do things, and we'll have certain areas where we agree to not do things. This is all being chucked. And the consequence is a massive misuse of resources. Ultimately, Russian resources will be misallocated, if you will, on a vast scale, and in the West we'll do the same thing. Who benefits? Well, for sure, oil producers in the Middle East will benefit. Saudi Arabia, first and foremost. United Arab Emirates, very quietly Iraq. We'll see how Iran comes along. I mean, if you have, you know, in the Middle East, they have invested pretty heavily in refining capacity, so they will be able to participate in helping Europe reduce its dependency on Russian diesel and jet fuel, et cetera, et cetera. And it will take, prices will get, so not just the producers, but the trading company, the big trading companies, Trafigura, Vitol, there's a half dozen giant global trading companies. They are going to make bank as long as they're able to operate in the futures market and constrain their risk in the transaction. And this has actually become a very big problem the last few months of 2021 and again this year, because of the big increase in prices and the enormous increase in volatility. The margin calls and the capital requirements to participate in the trade have ballooned. And this presents existential risk to even the biggest trading companies. I mean, for example, right now, I can't believe I didn't have it on this one. So the differential in gas prices between North America and Europe right now are such that you can make $100 million on a cargo. Now, somebody on somewhere is going to have to finance that. And if prices, prices were swinging, 30, 60% on a day. So that volatility is, I mean, it's bad enough in the equities market or any kind of market, but in the commodities market where you have to finance all this stuff and the margins are relatively thin, It's really dangerous. So companies are actually withdrawing from the market, and that it decreases liquidity and it increases volatility. So it's something to really pay attention to going forward, and they are in Europe. We'll see very quietly the governments stand in the shadows in the trading world to make sure that companies have access to necessary finance. There's more questions out here. I don't know,
Gary?
Charlize. Charlize, you asked a huge set of questions, and I hope I addressed some of it.
Yes, and one little quick thing is it's getting into bed with another devil, and hopefully, Europe will realize, if you invest in that alternative infrastructure, you're going to have potentially the exact same problems again. So is it possible that Canada can take up some of the extra slack, and Canada could be, a good resource? And then Venezuela, not that they're great, but they have always been the ones that have in the past, like in the 70s, sustained some sort of equilibrium by not going along with OPEC.
Right. So Venezuela, their industry is terribly degraded. It's the physical infrastructure is massively degraded, and it will take a lot of money. I mean, they'll be able to ramp up production a few 100,000 barrels a day, but the real expansion is years and years and years away, and will take billions and billions and billions of dollars to do it. So Canada is kind of a small player internationally, excepting the United States. U.S. imports around 4 million barrels a day out of Canada. It's the bitumen crude from Alberta, and most of that's refined here in the U.S. It's a long story, but I mean, the Canadians are tied to the U.S. Good luck to them, and thank God for them. So depending on where you are on that. I do want to get to the other questions that are out here. I think it's Gary. Gary, you're up next.
Yeah. So thanks for a great insight. Actually, back in 1979, 80, 81, 82, I was put in charge of a small bulk carrier and oil tanker and a product carrier company, and we did the time charters and the voyage charters. So I know a lot about what you said, and have really kept in contact with all of the issues since then. But I would like you to talk about, I don't know if you read this particular article. It's an article in Barron's, which was March 21st, Why Europe Wins and China Loses. This guy called Louis Vincent Gavi, I guess Gabe. And what he talks about is the sanctions. And, he talks about what happens when you put these sanctions in. We're breaking down the whole financial system, because you make contracts and then somebody can then decide to go and seize your assets or break contracts. Now, first of all, you got to realize I'm ethnically I'm Ukrainian. My grandparents came in 1902 to Winnipeg, and unfortunately, because Austria, which at that time that was a section of Austria-Hungary, the Ukrainians were now sort of the northwest corner of Ukraine. They passed an emergency act, put them in internment camps for 6 years, from 1914 to 1920. And I said, geez, that's not too good. But what happened is, just recently, Trudeau just went and passed the Emergency Act and seized the bank accounts of the truckers who were protesting in Windsor, Ontario, where I was born.
Oh my.
So I decided, hey, that's not good. So if you could take an act that, like that, why is there implications both in the United States? Biden says, hey, I don't like you guys. You voted for Trump, or, just general principles, decides to, do that. The breaking of sanctions and stuff means, is there any place safe now? I know the Russians are bad guys, but the general principle that you can sanction anybody seems like it's could could really break down a contract. What, I mean, Fox News, who I watch a lot, they talk about, oh, why don't we just escrow all the payments we make to Russia?
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. You escrow them, but when are the guys ever going to get the escrow back? Maybe
Right.
Putin will be sanctioned forever. They'll never get the money back. Maybe they'll use it for Ukrainian, rebuilding. So it seems like you've got such a big issue here that maybe the yuan's going to come in and take over. They said, and like I said, pay in rubles, pay in yuan. I'm sure that's what China is giving them. So it seems like there's going to be real implications for the future, just because this is such a widespread. Not that I don't agree that the Russians are bad guys, but it seems like beyond that fact, there's going to be a lot of problems with that. And so I'd encourage you guys to read that article. But I'd like to hear your comments on it, David.
Yeah, I mean, there were the scale on which sanctions are being, and again, most of it's on the financial so far, and we'll see how it ends up ultimately with energy. And with energy, it's more about policy. But the implication for the rule of law and for due process in wartime, the rule of law and due process get displaced to some degree or more, and that's what's coming, and more of it. And I think the world of business needs to take that on board in a really serious way. The contingency, the moment, can just supersede other values. And we'll see where it all ends up. Gosh,
if I could add a comment, just in the interest of time, Gary, that was a great question. Probably goes a little beyond the scope, because it's a real big question. And I would ask Gary, if you could, I'd be interested in reading that article. So if you can somehow forward some link or something for a reference to that
so
article.
why don't I just put it in the chat, or
put it in the chat.
Talking?
That'd be good. Yeah.
Hey, so I did want to address something out of that, Gary.
Dan, I'll forward it to you. Yeah.
Great. Appreciate it.
One thing that's coming out of this is that much of the commodities trade is financed using letters of credit. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. But for those of you that have been in business, you end up with, trusted relationships after a while. And while some different part of the organization may want, for their own reasons or whatever, to sustain that letter of credit process, there is the way you can trade on open account. You can do trade for cash. I mean, that's in the early days of business in Russia. When I was there, it was cash. There were no letters of credit, and we had to build relationships. And once they were there, they were trusted relationships, and so we could do things and move away from cash to providing credit on an open account without any kind of letter of credit thing. And that's actually how increasingly the oil trade in the Pacific between Russia and Russian companies and Chinese companies. Russia and China don't sell. I mean, Russia doesn't export oil to China. Russian companies export oil to Chinese companies, and it's being done increasingly on an open account cash basis. So but that also introduces uncertainties. If your individual cargo, your container, your tanker load is worth, $100 million, that's a lot of money. And, it would be really unfortunate if payment, didn't get made for some reason. I mean, there's a reason why letters of credit exist. If you do business, essentially you're doing business with your bank, you present transaction and logistics documents, and you get paid. And you don't have this, you have a different kind of counterparty risk, but it certainly contains it. on the one hand, it has the potential to introduce more inefficiencies in the system, but it also has another effect of where, and this has been going on for a couple decades now, where Chinese companies, Chinese managers, Chinese people, Russian companies, managers, and people are getting experience with each other because they need to. And while there's big cultural gaps and there are historical political baggage, the fact that they are working on practical things and gaining experience and developing trust is changing the nature of the relationship between the two countries at it's something different than, Beijing to Moscow, at the political level. It's at the more practical level of doing business. And that has implications for how countries get along or not with each other. So I didn't mention anything about technology, and there are a couple of people on the call that have either technology experience or interests, and the use of sanctions to target particular types of technological products like computer chips or advanced processing machinery at all. You can interdict into someone else's supply chain. You can interfere with their ability to to do business or to develop an economic sector or develop a company for that matter. And much of the technology trade will continue, but it'll all go through not sanctions. The term is licensing. Export licensing. That is going to become another job opportunity, employment opportunity for business, U.S. businesses doing business abroad in the technology sphere, is to an increasing degree that business will require one kind of export license or another, and that's staffing and that's expense. And the Chinese are experiencing while they're not directly sanctioned, they are playing along with the sanctions, just like, banks in London or in Europe or elsewhere. Chinese banks are very aware of the potential for financial consequences. So they're towing the line. They're going with the flow on sanctions so far. Same with the Chinese energy companies and their investment plans in Russia. They put those on hold for now. So it'll be interesting to see how this all works out going forward.
Okay.
Kind of running along here, Dan. How do you want to do this?
Well, clearly
questions out
we're
there.
way over on time. I think
Yeah.
people are fascinated with this, and we're all.
I
I
have-
can't
I
get
have
rid of
time.
my hand, so
I have time.
I'm not going to ask
so,
any more questions. I just can't find out how to
Oh.
get rid of my hand.
But
got-
yeah, David, if you can wrap it up with some conclusions at this point, and if there's any more that you wanted to cover, perhaps you can just give us a reference to that. And yeah, I think this is probably a good summary slide.
So there's too many takeaways on this. I didn't get a chance to boil it down. For the fourth day in the last month, we've had internet disrupted here in a nice suburb of San Diego. You gotta wonder. But the takeaways on this discussion here today, that really the financial channels are the main path for disruptive sanctions. For example, what Severstal is experiencing, this is going on throughout the commodities, throughout the shipping industry, and with these complex change, with these ecosystems, when it's not necessarily just the direct effect from one to another, it's the field effect is also there. I mean, it's changing the tone, the sense of security of doing business. just increasing people's risk sensitivity or sensitivity to uncertainty changes the price of how they price risk and uncertain to the degree that they can price uncertainty. There is a global energy shock on the way. The shortfalls are really not apparent yet. They will. This is a long term. This is a long thing coming. There's not going to be a resolution of the war in Ukraine anytime soon. And then ultimately the economic war with Russia, which is taking on a life of its own. This is all going to go on for this is years. This is not weeks or months. This is years. Diesel is if you are involved, if your business is involved in depending on diesel, if your car or truck or boat is depending on diesel, you better pay attention. You might not be able to get it when you want it, and then when you get it, you may have to really pay for it. Europe's de-Russification of their gas supply is going to have huge impacts on the U.S. LNG and the U.S. natural gas industry. That's a whole topic on its own. It is deeply complex. Fracked gas is very different than the traditional gas field output. It's just a totally different business. And the capital requirements are monumental in the ability of the U.S. to respond to, Europe's import of natural gas from Russia is around 150 billion cubic meters a year. The equivalent, it's the entire U.S. LNG export industry. The whole U.S. LNG industry is equal to that. And it took a decade to build. And not just build the machinery. Actually, that will be the easy part of, providing new gas to Europe. We'll be building the LNG facilities. The hard part is going to be to come up with the gas. And that's going to result in higher natural gas prices in the US and perhaps by a bunch. We'll see how that all comes. The world of logistics after the pandemic has stretched things, not just with containers, but bulk carriers and all. That's just going to get worse. And meanwhile, the pandemic is still underway and the Chinese are going into it headfirst into a very serious way. The last two items are where I want to focus now. So domestic politics and geopolitics have come to the center stage for business. You got to read those parts of the paper. It's no longer just about supply and demand or margins or efficiencies. You also now have to think in terms of supply chains. You have to think about resilience. You have to think about reliability. You have to think about cushion. You can be really, really efficient, but if you don't have it, you're not working, and that's really inefficient. So we will have to build in that the price of building in resilience will be extra cost, and it will be capital intensive as well for businesses and for economies. And so, we're headed into a very challenging time in the global economy where just moving to a more inefficient and expensive way of doing things will have big consequences. So stagflation, yeah. Anyways, so it's this will be a challenging time, and we'll get through it. But we're in one of those times as well, is that the visibility going forward. Talk about the fog of war. That fog is very much front and center for the world of commerce. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Boy, the thought that comes to my mind is, as depressing as it might be, is there's a very real chance, it seems to me, of a global depression that could come. There's also a very real chance periodically when Mr. Putin opens his mouth and doesn't deny the future use of nuclear weapons. It's something that can't be ignored. There's some really I mean, you made the point really well. This is not a war that's going to be over real quick in all of its facets. So again, David, appreciate some really impressive insights into all this from an economic perspective, as well as touching on some of the political perspectives.